you think England's got this wrong, do you?
Well, I think you got to look at it the other way around. I think Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and most of Europe have got this right. And I think the reason why Boris Johnson isn't following the restrictions which seem sensible right across Europe and in the majority of the United Kingdom is because he fears his own backbenchers who don't want these restrictions. But I think you also have to look at the fact that both the Welsh and Scottish governments are doing very well in the opinion polls, thank you, largely because they've handled the crisis, population sees it as such, handled it better than Boris. Perhaps you might say that's not difficult to do. So I think we've got to start by saying, why is it that Boris Johnson is down in the opinion polls? For many reasons. But why is Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford doing so well? And it's because they are seen to be handling this crisis well. And I'm quite worried looking at the news this morning of what's happening in the NHS in England, with hospitals declaring they're at the limit in Lincoln and Morecambe and Swindon. We've seen prior to New Year trains being cancelled into London, Victoria and elsewhere. Clearly, this disease might be not as fierce in terms of how it affects you, but it's much more prevalent. And it is taking people out.
OK, so, let me just go to James on that. James, Chris saying very clearly, England's got to step up and follow Scotland.
He can say that all he likes, he'd be wrong. I think when you look at what we're trying to deal with here is we're now dealing with a population that was told and advised that the 2 jabs and maybe the COVID booster as well would allow us to live more normal lives. I don't think you see any less hospitalizations or any less cases or any less deaths as a result of the measures which have been put into place in either Wales or Scotland in particular, and Northern Ireland to an extent. I think it's window dressing. Now, you can criticise Boris Johnson, as I think we all would, for making some terrible mistakes in terms of putting in rules and then not leading by example. All of that stuff is a nonsense. However, I think the vaccination programme has been a success. I think the data representation which we need to have is poor. So, for example, we talk about cases getting out of control. I don't actually think that matters so much. What matters is who is getting ill, who is in hospital, who is passing it on, and then how do we curtail it, and then what measures do we need to take. So, I think we're going to look to live.
Let me go to Ash. Sorry, James. Where are you on this, Ash? The idea Scotland's tighter, Wales is tighter, England is looser. Where would you go?
Do you know what? I'm going to be a dreadful centrist for once, Jeremy, and say that the data is mixed. So the really positive stuff is that vaccination has clearly made a big difference to the severity of the disease, as has the fact that Omicron looks to be a milder variant overall. Those are 2 things which are very encouraging. I do also think that there are things you have to bear in mind beyond simply hospitalizations and deaths. And one is, with a number of people self-isolating, can public institutions continue to function? So when you have 1 in 10 NHS staff having to self-isolate, and you already have a huge capacity issue, and this has been 10 years in the making because of austerity, then even a small number of hospitalizations, or smaller compared to the Alpha variant, still puts a lot of pressure on the NHS combined with staffing shortages. So for me, the key question here isn't, how do you use the only tool you have, i.e. the hammer of more restrictions? It's also, how do you build in greater capacity and invest in mitigation measures? Yeah. Now, this has been, I think, Boris Johnson's very big failure. We haven't seen that build up in NHS capacity that we really need, and we haven't seen adequate investment in mitigation measures, which would allow us to, as the backbenchers say, live with the virus.
All right, yeah, but we're on restrictions here. And Chris, you've been challenged by James there, because James rightly says, if you look at Scotland and Wales, they don't have, well, they're pretty much on the same case level throughout the pandemic. Now, maybe they look more decisive and persuasive, but the fact is the virus seems to get round these measures.
My challenge is not that the virus is more prevalent in England than it is in Scotland. In fact, Scotland made some mistakes. It allowed a Scottish League Cup football final to go ahead, which allowed the Omicron variant to spread wildly. And that's one of the reasons why the restrictions have come in. The worry, I think, is right on this, is the NHS, as we know, as Ash points out, is fully stretched at the best of times. With the number of self-isolation, it is very worrying what is happening there. And the Royal College of Nursing is calling for restrictions to be implemented.
Can't you just change the rules on isolation to get round that and cut it to 5 days? That's not about people being seriously ill. That's just about the rules.
We have cut it to 7 days from 10, if you remember. So, I mean, I'd be open to considering that with the medical evidence. I think we also have to address the question of the number of people refusing vaccines. You can't force them to be vaccinated, and some have actually taken it up, but clearly it's a problem. May I point out the vaccination programme has worked because the National Health Service is running it, not the privatisers, which we saw at the beginning, who made a complete mess of the trace and contact system.
Disagrees with that, James.
So it's ironic that Boris has been bailed out by the NHS.
Soon as you politicise and start to turn, as you both have to an extent, I don't think, look, if we'd have Keir Starmer, we would have had different rules and different regulations. If we had, there are all sorts of things that you can bring out and make your political points if you want, but it's a bit pathetic, really. I think the issue here is that the rollout has been public-private partnership. We know that the NHS has done an incredible job in a rollout, but then the czar who was brought in, if you like, used private company historics and methods in order to make sure that we really got hold of the vaccine and made the orders and got them done. So you can play the politics if you like, but it's a combined effort.
But we're on restrictions here. And Chris, you clearly believe the more restrictions, the better, correct?
I don't believe more restrictions better. I think these restrictions are fairly mild compared to what we had in the previous 2 lockdowns. So we're not talking about going back to that. But I may say that, this is a matter for the United Kingdom. 3 nations of the United Kingdom have entered these restrictions. Across Europe, we may have left the European Union, but I think we should pay attention to our neighbours that they have implemented those restrictions. These aren't particularly draconian, to have just 6 people in the pub, to wear a mask on public transport or in public places. January would seem to me, in terms of the hospitality sector, in terms of pubs and stuff like that, would be the slackest month of the year for them. So it might be a good time or the best time of year to implement those restrictions. But I am worried.
James is shaking his head at that because presumably you're worried. Go on, James.
It's just all of these things are a placebo implementation of just plans which make no sense. If it makes sense, if there is medical evidence, if the evidence is there, then of course we should do things. I'm not a naysayer. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about the spread or indeed absenteeism and all that stuff. That having been said, if it makes no difference, the damage on the other side in terms of cancelled hospital admissions, cancelled schools, cancelled businesses, and the precarious nature of which our hospitality and entertainment business is not an acceptable risk to take for something that does nothing. If it does something, then that's great, but it does nothing.